you've heard of speed dating? This is speed revolution. First question, is civilization a war against the living world? Next question, is that war a metaphor or is it real? Because right now, on the left, there's a whole crew of people who would say, not only is that a metaphor, it's the wrong metaphor. There's no enemy, there's no us and them, there's just well-meaning, if wounded, people. Now that actually cuts to one of the main divisions between liberals and radicals, as we've already discussed. But power is not a mistake out of which the powerful can be educated. It's not a misunderstanding, and it's not a disagreement. Justice is not won by moral argument, it's not won by exhortation, it's not won by individual transformation, and it's not won by spiritual epiphany. It's won by taking power away from the powerful and dismantling their institutions. So these were the categories of response that we've discussed already, but I want to talk about withdrawal a little bit more here. I feel like withdrawal is one of the graveyards where the environmental movement is going to die. Sort of crawled off there and left the rest of us standing here without a strategy. The main difference between withdrawal, again, as a successful strategy and as a failed strategy is whether that withdrawal is seen as linked to political resistance or whether it's seen as sufficient in itself. Again, issues of identification and loyalty are crucial to building political consciousness needed for resistance movements. But this alone is not enough. The withdrawal has got to go beyond the emotional, the psychological, the intellectual. It's got to include that goal of actually winning justice. So I'm going to walk us through a successful example of this from history. And this example, sort of randomly, is one of the ones we use in our book, but it's the Irish struggle for independence. Now, the Irish had endured 800 years of English occupation with the usual horrors. In 1880, there's a movement that begins. It's called the Gaelic Revival. Now, this is a movement that sought to bring self-respect and cultural pride to the Irish as Irish. So they're teaching the language, which was going extinct, theater, poetry, music, dance. These are all really ancient traditions across Ireland. So they had a lot to work with. And then you had people like Maude Gun. This was her newspaper. If you don't, she's a phenomenal character. If you don't know who she was, look her up. But she did everything. She did all the culture of resistance stuff. She was in plays. She did illustrated beautiful manuscripts with Gaelic illustration, put out this newspaper, did a lot of stuff with theater. And then she went on to do a lot of support for Irish political prisoners, including smuggling things into the prisons. She found men who had been in prison for over 10 years for the Irish struggle who had never once received a letter from home. She's like, this is appalling. So she started to do all this political support, ended up smuggling stuff in. She got caught, and she ends up in Holloway prison herself. She went on a hunger strike and nearly died for 60 days. And she won some really basic rights for political prisoners in Ireland. Like, we are political prisoners, so we are going to be treated as such, right? She won these rights for people. She went on to become a judge for the Irish Free State when they had their own court system. She also produced a son, Sean McBride, whose career is at least as illustrious as hers. So this was a real culture of resistance across the generations. These are phenomenal people. Anyway, this is Maude Gun. This is her newspaper. And then you had interesting groups like, this is the Gaelic Athletic Association. So you think, what, they're running around on the field playing games. Well, yeah, but they revived traditional Irish sports. And what this actually is, it's a training ground for what became the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was the kernel of the IRA. So they're not just playing games. They're learning how to think strategically. They're learning how to work as a team. And they're learning to value their own physical fitness and to be strong. And this is what becomes the IRA. So all of this comes together, this Gaelic revival, and it becomes the cradle of what's called the Land War. Now, this was a struggle that started around 1900. The Irish had lost control of their land almost entirely. So there's all this like poverty and starvation, these terrible things happening because the English and the wealthy Irish were in charge. So they start to wage this campaign, and it's almost entirely using nonviolent techniques. So a lot of civil disobedience and these kind of boycotts, these rent strikes. And it's wildly successful. By the beginning of the First World War, by 1914, 90% of the land in Ireland was once again in the hands of small and medium-sized farmers. So they did it. It was just absolutely amazing. So with that incredible success, they went on to wage the actual struggle for independence. But I love the language in these old posters. I don't know if you can read this, but redeem your character now, right? Don't you have like a list of people you want to say that to? Redeem your character now, sir. I just love that. So anyway, so they go on to win that, to wage this actual war. And it all starts with the Gaelic Revival, with that culture of resistance. Nobody said, okay, we're just going to put on some nice plays and we're going to sing some nice songs and somehow the English will go away. right? Nobody said if we simply change our consciousness and if we love each other as Irish enough, that will do the trick. We don't actually have to confront this vicious, brutal system of power. Okay, we can somehow just do this by changing what we think about it all. No, the Irish culture of resistance believed in resistance, it encouraged it, it prepared for it, it supported it, and ultimately planned for its success. So they did everything from, the political prisoner support, so they got money for families that were in distress when somebody went to jail. They had a whole underground to get people out of Ireland. They got money actually from the government for school children who were, there was mass starvation, so they were able to get food. They set up their own court system to settle disputes, and they demanded loyalty to Ireland and the Irish cause. Ultimately, they waged both nonviolent and violent struggle, and they were almost completely successful. So they used all three categories. They used the legal, they used the direct action, and they used withdrawal, okay? But they all worked together strategically to form first the culture of resistance and then a very successful resistance movement. So the part of withdrawal that's necessary is breaking through that psychology of the oppressed, okay? So that accommodation, denial, and consent that we talked about earlier. Breaking through that is absolutely crucial, and we can follow the same trajectory through a lot of different resistance movements. The civil rights movement is another great example, because you've got the Harlem Renaissance, and a generation later, you get the civil rights movement, and it's the same idea. Okay, it's taking pride in being an African American, in your history, and the struggle. So all of that psychological, we're going to identify as being black, and then you get black is beautiful. You get the slogan, and the whole thing kicks off, right? So it's the same pattern, and across history, you'll find that often there's a generation or two that does that kind of cultural work, but they don't unhitch it from the fact that they're going to have to wage a struggle. And that's where we've gone wrong, I think, across the left at this point in the United States anyway. And I think that part of this is our hardest task as radicals, is to face that we've gone really far astray with this. And we are going to have to reinsert this concept of resistance, in whatever way we're comfortable doing in our lives. But that's one of our jobs as the above ground, is to keep pushing the idea of resistance, because that's what the left has dropped. So why is so much of the left insisting on personal solutions, right? Withdrawal as sort of the main strategy, the vague millenarianism as kind of a fallback plan, especially when the entire planet is at stake, right? I mean, the risks could not be higher here. Well, we need a little more history. My ex always says that history is same characters, different costumes, and we are about to find out just how right that is. A lot of the history that I'm about to go through, all of it, is from Western Europe, and that's not because I think Europe is so great. It's because it's really those European cultural norms are still really hegemonic across the left. I get that not everybody in this room comes from that background, but the point is that no matter where we're from, we're up against the same forces that came from Europe to the United States that are still making it really hard to form a resistance movement. But I think it's important just to say that out loud. So, all right, so across Europe, you can go back to the ancient Greeks. You will find these dissenting groups. We don't really have time to get into this too much, but it's the same pattern over and over. We're going to pick this up about 2,000 years later into the Romantic movement, which is sort of an offshoot of some of this. So this is an artistic movement that begins in the second half of the 18th century in Western Europe. At least partly, it's a reaction against the Age of Enlightenment, which valued rationality. You have the ascendancy of science, and there's a mechanistic reduction of the cosmos to a machine. Up until that point, across the Middle Ages, even through the Renaissance, the guiding image of the age is that the Earth and the universe and ultimately sort of the cosmos is a living body, and we are part of that body. And that all gets replaced with the image of the machine. So now it's clockwork that we can fiddle with. And as the Industrial Revolution gained strength, the communities are just devastated across Europe. So the rivers are poisoned and destroyed, the forests come down, the commons are turned into private property. It is the same story everywhere. And the people are pushed off their land into urban squalor. So partly this is a reaction to that, so this Romantic movement. There's three themes across the Romantics. The past was better. The heroic isolation of the individual, especially the artist. And we have to remember that civilization is a very... it makes people feel alienated. So there's a reason that they sort of take this up. And then this respect for this wild, pure nature, which they have now lost across Europe at this point in time. So Germany in particular produces a lot of the art and the literature of the Romantic movement. And there are reasons for that, but we don't need to get into it. And out of this comes another social movement, and this is the Lebensreform people. So, especially from Germany, they emphasize physical fitness and natural health. Does any of this sound a wee bit familiar? This was not invented in the 60s. So there's all variations on this theme of reestablishing a connection with nature, that's what's healing and that's what is going to make it all better. Everybody from Isadora Duncan to Leon Trotsky to Franz Kafka passes through this world at some point. Okay, so there's all this foment of ideas going on. Gandhi was a fan of a Lebensreform. He sets up a nature cure clinic in India. So that goes east, and what goes west comes back this way is yoga and Ayurvedic medicine and Hinduism and Buddhism and meditation. So there's this sort of, trade where the fruits and the nuts kind of, back and forth with each other. So the Lebensreform people set up their own schools, their own clinics, and their own intentional communities. So this is Ascona in Switzerland. This is like the Big Sur of the age. This is 1903, I think. Now, some of these people are school teachers in Berlin. And they start taking their students out on hikes, after school, because they're all into getting back to nature, right? So you go out in the mountains, you have a hike. The afternoons extend into weekends, and then the weekends even get longer. And eventually what happens is all these teenagers from sort of middle-class Berlin, they drop out of their middle-class lives, and they coalesce into their own subculture. And it becomes a lifestyle. And hence we come to the Wandervogel. Now, I'm always really curious. How many of you have heard of the Wandervogel? Oh, this is great. It's way more than I've ever seen. That's amazing. Usually nobody raises their hands, and then I get to say, well, you know the drill. Ignorant of history, condemned to repeat it. So here we are with the Wandervogel. So this is the origin of the youth hostel movement, because what they do is they wander around rural Germany and they take over abandoned buildings, including castles and farms and all kinds of stuff, and anybody can stay there for free. So they're wandering all around, like in the mountains. They're singing folk songs. They write a lot of their own music. They play with fasting, raw foods, vegetarianism. They are the anarchist vegan squatters of the age, okay? Not much has changed. This is all before the year 1900, all right? So the connections between the Lebensreform, the Wandervogel, and the 1960s subculture in the US, they're startlingly direct. So, for instance, these two painters set the artistic style of the age. This is 1900. This is not 1965. And what I have, the red arrow up there on the top, that's a peace sign. I don't know if you can see it, but they're already using that as their icon, as the peace sign. So it's World War I. Some of them are draft resistors. I mean, they're pacifists. They don't want to fight this war. And there's already a lot of immigration from, especially Germany, other parts of Europe, coming into the United States. So they sort of ride that wave, and they get to the United States. They're transplanted. And where do they go? Well, you're not going to do this in Michigan. They come to California. If you're going to wander around half naked and eat fruit, this is where they land. California. There's an entire book about the history of these people coming to the United States, setting up camp here. Lots of other examples. This was two of the German immigrants who wrote some of these texts. These become basic books for the hippies in Haight-Ashbury in the 60s. So this is an unbroken line of cultural continuity. And I mean, literally, it's some of the same people. They're the immigrants, then there's one more generation, and then it's right into Woodstock and Jefferson Starship and Frank Zappa and the Beatles, and they know these people, and it's this unbroken line. I was just amazed to learn this history. Anyway, what we need is an oppositional culture, right? We need an actual culture of resistance. What we've got is this alternative culture, right, that refuses to take up resistance. So I started to make my handy-dandy chart. I'm very pleased with this chart. We have bigger versions of it, not to worry. So I started to make my chart, and I was trying to figure out, where did this go wrong? What exactly are the parts of this culture that have got the wrong thing going? And suddenly I had this moment where the light bulb went off, because I realized that I was looking at a culture that had been created by the teenage brain. This was a culture that had been created by adolescents. In the year 1911 in Germany, there were more 17-year-olds than there ever would be again, right? So, of course, they create their own little subculture with the Wandervogel. The whole thing gets transplanted to the United States. It goes dormant for a generation. It starts to pick up speed with the beatniks, many of the same themes, but it really comes into its own at about 1960. What happens in 1960? It's another bumper crop of 17-year-olds. Of course, this is what they're attracted to. It's a culture created by people exactly like them. So, of course, this is the most appealing thing on the planet. So, alternative culture. I've got this broken down. It's a little bit bigger. All right. Well, the main difference between the alternative and the oppositional is really basic. Are you hostile to the concept of political engagement? Because on the oppositional side, you consciously embrace the concept of resistance. And that's just absolutely flat out. It's the basic thing. And that's what we're missing right now. We don't have an oppositional culture. So to break this down a little more, on the alternative side, change, of course, is seen in psychological and cultural terms, right? And that goes right back to that liberal radical distinction again. Because for the oppositional culture, it's got to be economic and political. You're trying to take control of these institutions so you can dismantle them in some way. So over on the alternative side, it's individual consciousness is your appropriate target, right? Because you're trying to change people's psychology. Again, very liberal. And over on the other side, actually, you're going to target concrete institutions, the ones that have the power. So these are the adolescent values of a youth movement over here. And for a real culture of resistance, we would need adult values of discernment and responsibility, because this is going to take a whole lot of sacrifice. So for the adolescent brain, of course, all authority is rejected out of hand, whereas on the other side, legitimate authority is accepted and cultivated. So a lot of this is, again, that sort of liberal radical distinction, and that focus on the individual being the hallmark of liberalism. So, personal example becomes this political strategy. I mean, I don't think ever before in the history of the world have people taken up personal example as an actual political strategy, but that's sort of what we've been left with, here at this bad moment. So, you get this emphasis on things like, gardening and riding your bike, and I mean, they're good things, but these are not actually political strategies, right? And so it's your personal carbon footprint, right? That's what we're all supposed to be focused on is, what we're consuming, what we're not. And I just have to point out, am I the only one who's noticed that when you're talking about carbon footprint, that is the only time that men try to prove they're smaller? Just saying. By their nature, agricultural societies are imperialist, right? They're based on drawdown. Civilization follows that same pattern over and over, where they conquer the region, they've got the colonies, they extract what they want, they leave the place a desert. That's been going on for 10,000 years. And what that means is for 10,000 years, these invading, sadistic, cultures of drawdown and entitlement have come into contact with other cultures that, many of which were egalitarian, peaceful, sustainable cultures, right? This is the pattern for 10,000 years. In all of that time, the living example of a culture that is egalitarian and sustainable has never once stopped the invaders, okay? It has never once worked as a strategy, okay? They've seen the good example. It does not change the invaders, okay? History is literally the story of those invasions wiping out the nice people, and this is what we're left with, is the sociopaths on top. So we just need to really say this out loud. Personal example has never worked. We got to give this one up. There's too much at stake. The farthest extreme of this kind of individualism is where personal lifestyle becomes personal purity, and identity itself is declared some kind of a political act. And this is where subcultures start to feel like cults. I think a lot of you know what I mean. But any strategy based on individual change is doomed to fail, because oppression is not an individual condition. It's a group condition, and it will require group action. So the defining characteristic of the oppositional culture is that it consciously claims to be that cradle of resistance. Okay, so here we have this, this list of the kind of adolescent concerns. And the thing to know is that the adolescent brain is still under construction. They used to think that our brains were built by the time we were 12. It's completely not true. The brain may reach a certain size by the time you're 12, but all kinds of stuff is going on for another 10 years in there. But basically the areas that are responsible for impulse control, for planning, especially long-range planning, for considering consequences, and for managing emotional states, they go offline a lot when you're a teenager. So adolescents cannot understand cause and effect. It's their brains cannot make the connection. And they're really bad at long-term consequences. So they're prone to risk-taking, these lightning flashes of anger, really impulsive behavior, and overall emotional intensity. And that's really the hallmarks of the age, right? This is the phase of life when this question of who I am takes on such extraordinary importance. And there is nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's your job when you're 15, right? Is to figure out who you are and what you're going to be with yourself, what you're going to do. The problem is, though, when that takes over and becomes the sort of guiding, principle of this whole culture. So the idea of authority is rejected out of hand, whereas a serious resistance movement would, in fact, be training appropriate people for leadership. On the alternative culture, the enemy is seen as this constraining set of values. Conventions are the problem, rather than systems of power. And so their main program is one of attacking boundaries rather than injustice. And this has had serious consequences across the left. It's been pretty much a disaster for women and girls. The creators of this counterculture weren't just any teenagers. They were middle class, they were privileged, and they were male. This is not necessarily a great combo. Now, alienation may be a good place to start. I mean, you have to start somewhere with, this world is not working for me, why? So I think, a lot of us started this sort of the path that we are on by feeling alienated as teenagers, and so we start to question. And that's what teenagers do really well. But it can't stop there. Because to build a resistance movement, you need loyalty and you need solidarity. And alienated individuals are by definition alienated. Okay, they can't do loyalty and solidarity. You've got to kind of get over that and start to make common cause with people. Second half of my chart. This concern of identity, who I am, it takes on this importance that outweighs what one might actually do. Now, the counterculture, as we know it, is a product of the psychology, and that's where it's been permanently stuck. The concerns of adolescence, so the gifts and the shortcomings of the age, are the framework for the alternative culture. And those community norms and habits have become accepted across the left in what Theodore Roszak calls a progressive adolescentization of dissenting thought and culture. He said that in 1968, I think. So it's really great when you find out, like, oh, somebody else thought of this, but then you're like, well, I'm like 40 years behind already. I mean, he already had this down. So yes, the progressive adolescentization of dissenting thought and culture. And he was absolutely right. So this is the motto of the von der Vogel. I'm not joking. This was their motto. Same characters, different costumes. Abby Hoffman, Revolution for the Hell of It. Now, on the positive side, the gifts of youth are that incredible moral vigor, that fearless courage, the passion, the idealism, right? Every movement needs an infusion of the constant infusion of those things. Honestly, by the time you're 30, it's pretty well over. You need the young people to come and give you that again. But the alternative culture stops that vigor from effective action. And when you can't fight power, all you can fight is each other. So this is what Florence Kennedy called horizontal hostility, and this is our diagram. So in the first panel, the king has all the power, and he's really happy because the little people haven't figured out they can fight. The second panel, they've made solidarity with each other, and they're fighting back. There's resistance. King is not happy. In the third panel, they've cut off any concept of resistance. So they don't believe they can fight up that hierarchy. All they can do is fight with each other. So horizontal hostility is what they're left with. This can be a feeding frenzy of things like ugly gossip, character assassination. In more militant groups, it can end with paranoid accusations, and in really the worst instances, it ends with people shooting each other. Ultimately, it's caused by fighting horizontally rather than fighting vertically, up the hierarchy. But if the only thing we can change is ourselves, and if our best tactic for social change is lifestyle changes, then indeed examining and critiquing the minutiae of people's lives feels like a righteous activity. If in the end it reminds you a little bit of junior high school, well, there's a reason for it. And the final thing with the von der Vogel, they create the whole romantic movement, they create this image of the peasant. So the peasants are supposed to be authentic and anti-rational and in touch with nature and semi-mystical. Their idea of a peasant had nothing to do with actual peasants who did, in fact, exist in Germany and could have used some help. Now, the von der Vogel gets transplanted to the United States. There aren't any peasants in the U.S. So instead, they take the same template and they apply it to two groups. They get pressed into service for the needs of the privileged and, oops, wrong way. Generally, it's Native Americans and African Americans who get cast as emotional and natural and authentic and childlike and all this. I'm really hoping I don't have to explain what's wrong with this picture. Okay, chart again. So on the side of the alternative, this cultural appropriation becomes the norm, where everybody's spiritual practices are basically your shopping mall. Because honestly, if the main goal is just to feel better about yourself and have personal transformation, well, why not just use what works? It's just completely depoliticized. On the side of an actual oppositional culture, of course, the main task would be to protect indigenous communities with whatever solidarity we can offer, and certainly to keep sacred ceremonies from exploitation and abuse. So that's pretty much the alternative oppositional. There are plenty of successful resistance movements who have created cultures of resistance that worked long term. The people over 30 generally lay a lot of the groundwork. So that's often for a generation or two. In the civil rights movement, you had two groups. You had the Harlem Renaissance, and then you had the Pullman Porters. And they added different things into this mix. The Pullman Porters were like the bridge between slavery and the civil rights movement. They took a culture of survival, which was hard enough. But they start to build a culture of resistance from that. And so along the way, they're accumulating some really important things: self-respect, cultural pride, political experience, and material resources. The Pullman porters were like anchors in the black community because they had good jobs that had a lot of security. And so all of that was necessary. And then you get the next generation, you get the college students who are willing to sit down at the lunch counters and face the angry mob. And then the 4 guys who kicked this off were all freshmen. They were college freshmen. They were 18 years old. By the time this was done, 70,000 college students had done sit-ins across the South. They were calling it the Second Civil War. That's how many people participated in this. So these were 18, 19-year-olds. Then you've got even younger kids. This is the Children's Crusade, right? I mean, the world was electrified by these pictures. The fact that anybody would turn a fire hose on a 12-year-old. And then even younger. This is little Ruby Bridges. She's single-handedly desegregating the Louisiana public school system. And I got to say that we got no right to be standing on the sidelines wringing our hands. We can't do anything. It's all too much. When a 6-year-old can produce this kind of courage, right? I think she's amazing. She's got an autobiography. You can read her memoir about what this was like. The British suffragists follow a really similar pattern in that you've got these 3 generations of women who are doing all this work about suffrage and abolition and labor movement, and they don't get very far, but they're accumulating all kinds of resources and political experience. The Pankhursts in Britain were just phenomenal leaders of this movement, and they had been involved for 3 generations in this whole struggle. But Emmeline, who really became one of the leaders, when she was 5 years old, she had Uncle Tom's Cabin read to her as a bedtime story. That's a culture of resistance. And they were trained in this movement, like how to think politically. This great quote: "Young as I was, I could not have been older than 5 years old. I knew perfectly well the meaning of the words slavery and emancipation." Right? Now, in turn, she raises her daughters, Christabel and Emmeline, to be part of the struggle. They used to cry because they were too young to go to political meetings. It was so sweet. And at one point, young Christabel says to her mom, "How long you women have been trying for the vote. For my part, I mean to get it." And Emmeline writes in her journal, "Was there a difference between trying for the vote and getting the vote?" And she realizes what she has to do. She's got to create an organization that puts together the experience, the accumulated wisdom of the women who've been doing this for generations with that fearless courage of the young, with her daughter saying, "We're not going to lose, we got to do this." If she could make an organization that combined those 2 things, they would win. And she was absolutely right, and that was what she did. The WSPU was born, and they engage in, first, massive civil disobedience. They completely up the stakes. They hound members of parliament and the prime minister. And they were arrested, they went to jail, and they went to prison, and they were tortured. A specific law was passed by Parliament that let them be tortured. It even used the female pronoun, so the prisoner she. It's called the Cat and Mouse Act. And when that didn't work, Christabel escalated the troops to arson. So they blew up golf courses and mailboxes, historic buildings and railway stations all across England. That was how women won the vote. You don't get to learn that in school, but that was what they did. Gandhi learned most of what he knew from the suffragists. He subscribed to 3 different London newspapers so he could keep up with their actions because they were such great strategists. They were also loved by their movement, and this is something we don't see that much anymore. The left now has this terrible tendency to cannibalize its leaders. I think this goes right back to those adolescent values, that knee-jerk against all authority. This was not always the case, though. So here's Emmeline talking to a crowd. The lengths that people went to protect her, because the police were always trying to rearrest her, because they knew if they could destroy the leadership, they would bring the movement down. Christabel, her daughter, actually spent 2 years in Paris, running the movement from Paris in exile because she didn't want to get arrested again. But Emmeline, there's just great stories. They knew what the parade route was down to where she was going to be speaking, so they knew she'd be traveling that route. And the police went to every single house. This is a poor section of London. They went to every single house and offered them like £100. Will you let us set up in the front room and arrest her when she comes by? Not a single house would take the money. It was just incredible amounts of loyalty to these people. So resistance movements need that infusion, the young, the moral vigor, the courage. We don't get anywhere without that. But they also need the experience, the stability, and the material resources of the people who are middle-aged and older. And the take-home point really is that successful resistance movements are always multi-generational. You got to have both. If you break the natural bonds between the young and the old, it means that political wisdom never accumulates. So you never learn what you need to learn. And what it means now is that the young are not being socialized into a culture of resistance. What they're being socialized into is this absolutely toxic culture created by corporate America, which has everything to gain by destroying our capacity for community, never mind our community, our capacity for resistance. So a few simple questions here. Are we after shock value, or are we after justice? Is the problem a constraining set of values or an oppressive set of material conditions? Are we content to coexist alongside, the state of things with all the horrors that are going on? Are we content to just coexist in our own little bubble, no matter how repelled we are by those horrors? And is the self really an appropriate long-term project? Or could we move on to something a little bit bigger now? Because another 200 species went extinct today, and they were my kin. What we need is organized political resistance. So the task of an activist is not to navigate around these systems of oppression with as much personal integrity as possible. It's to dismantle those systems. And this is where we've gone wrong. To get to a real resistance, we're going to need that culture, the culture of resistance. Instead, what we have, I call this the permaculture wing, right? Not that I've got anything against permaculture, but the permaculture, the transition town, the voluntary simplicity people, I actually call them the oin bees, only in my backyard. Taken as a whole, they dismiss political action as impractical or impossible. And this is a very bad habit that the left is going to have to break if we're going to get anywhere. We are the people who should be shouting from every rooftop and from every street corner. Not only is resistance possible, failure is impossible given what's at stake. So let's pretend for a minute, thought experiment. We are in Nazi-occupied France. We are in U.S.-occupied Vietnam. We are in U.S.-occupied North America. Does anybody really want to suggest that riding bikes and buying organic shampoo would drive them out? Yet, this is the strategy that the left seems to be suggesting. I know that it's really hard to name a perpetrator. It's certainly hard to name the perpetrators of global destruction, and there's a lot against us in this. But they do have names and addresses, as Utah Phillips famously pointed out, and more important, the infrastructure of industrial civilization is incredibly vulnerable, and that's a point to which we will return in a minute. So how would a resistance movement be organized? Well, across history, you've got pretty much the same pattern. You've got the one side that's just the tasks of the culture of resistance. Their job is to build the new institutions that can take over and will organize the new, better society as the old one comes down in whatever way. And then on the other side, you've got these combatants. They're doing the actual frontline resistance. They're doing the direct confrontations with power. Now, I want to be very clear. When I say combatants, that does not have to mean violence. Okay? Nonviolence and violence are not the distinctions here. This distinction is really between doing something and doing nothing. Between fighting power in whatever way, naming power and fighting it, doing that confrontation, and submitting to power. Those are the main distinctions. From there, we can make other distinctions, we can make other decisions, but those come later. You've got to decide first that you're actually going to do something. So we need lots and lots of people to do that standard work that cultures of resistance do. The local economies, the participatory democracy, systems of justice that we can all agree to. I would say character building towards self-respect, breaking that identification, with the overlords, and then direct support for the front lines. So, loyalty and whatever materials we can come up with. All right, here's the truth. The vast majority of people are not going to resist shit. And I think that we just have to accept that. I fought that a lot when I was in my 20s. I fought and fought and fought. I fought with everybody I could fight with. There's no point. Most people simply don't have it in them. Of those that do, it's still only 2% that are needed for those frontline positions. And that's true in regular armies. Only 2% of the U.S. military actually has a combat role. The other 98% do support. It was true in the IRA. Only 2% of those guys ever picked up a weapon. The other 98%, and it was a huge range of people. There were 10-year-olds who carried messages. I mean, it was an amazing mobilization. But 98% of those people did support. Most people do not have the personality to do the direct, for the frontline stuff, or they can't take the risks for lots and lots of legitimate reasons. If you've got kids, you're pretty much out of the picture. If you've got aging parents who need you, you can't do this. We have responsibilities, human responsibilities. So it's mostly going to be young people who don't have, a lot of kind of responsibilities yet on their plates who can take this up, and you find that all over. The last 40 minutes of this, though, the last 40 years of my life, really, this has been for those of you who are the 2%, because I know you're here, and you're really the ones that I want to talk to. We need warriors who will put themselves between what is left of this planet and fossil fuel. Okay? We need to stop industrial civilization. Now, if we had the numbers, we could do that using nonviolence. I mean, we could shut this party down by midnight using human blockades. I don't see the numbers. I would love to be wrong. I would vastly prefer to wage the struggle using nonviolence, but I don't see the numbers. My longing will not bring them forth, and it's a little late in the day for millennialism. So given a realistic assessment of what we actually have, the only strategy that I can see that can be effective is direct attacks on infrastructure. In very blunt terms, we need to stop them. Now, this is not a game for children, and this revolution is not for the hell of it. We need a serious underground movement that has the discipline, the training, the command structure, and the strategic savvy to coordinate decisive attacks on a continental scale. And we needed it yesterday. And it would be really great if the permaculture wing would get on board and at least provide the loyalty and material support. But the smallest thing they can do is to stop saying that this can't be done. It can. The only real question is, why aren't we doing it? And I hate that part of the answer may be that we are the people who benefit from this repulsive arrangement of power. And that makes it hard. Well, not only can it be done, but there are manuals that will tell you how. So, for instance, we have the U.S. Field Manual on Guerrilla Warfare. Now, this was written by your tax dollars, so you might as well read it. Just saying. Asymmetric warfare. If there was ever an asymmetric conflict, this is it. So, the 6 principles of asymmetric warfare. This is when one group has all the money and the guns and the power, and the other group doesn't have anything. That pretty much would sum us up, I think. This is not a pitched battle, because you'd never win. So it's a stupid thing to even call for. What you're after is something called cascading systems failure. Okay, cascading systems failure. Okay, you accomplish your objective swiftly, and then you disappear to fight again. Now, need I add, the point is not to make a statement; it's to have a decisive material impact. Now, the reason you can learn about asymmetric warfare in places like West Point and the U.S. Army and training camps all over the world is because it works. The principles have been honed for decades. As a strategy, direct attacks on infrastructure, it's highly effective. So, got to stop people from saying that this doesn't work. I mean, proven, tried and true. This works. Beyond these principles, you can learn about target selection. This hits my happy spot. Criticality, how important is this target? Vulnerability, how tough is the target? Accessibility, can you get to it? And finally, recuperability, what would it take for them to replace it? And suddenly, there's some stuff that starts to make sense. One of the reasons that groups like the ELF and the ALF have really had no decisive success is target selection. All their targets are low criticality, high recuperability. Very typical for resistance groups that lacks training. Right? Targets are chosen because they're easy to get to, they're accessible, but those targets aren't in any way critical, and they're really easily repaired. This would be your basic Starbucks window strategy. Now, I say this as someone who has broken her share of windows. I have personally destroyed thousands of dollars of property. Yeah, it's a lot of fun, but if this is what you're doing, it's basically pointless. Why? Low criticality, high recuperability. Breaking windows does not stop the bad people from doing that bad thing for even 1 second. We've got to stop thinking like vandals and start thinking like field commanders. So we've been carrying out these operations that are emotionally appealing in the hopes that they will somehow be effective. Now, I call this emotional activism. This was also the problem, for instance, with groups like the Weather Underground. Increasing your firepower will not actually increase the effectiveness of your strategy. So you're not going to walk away from this with like a serious grounding in the principles of guerrilla warfare. My point, though, is that other people have already figured this out. They are serious people, and they are people who intend to win. They have a goal, they have a grand strategy, and after examining the actual resources at hand, they move on to tactics. So I would say we have a 2-part goal: disrupt and dismantle industrial civilization, to remove the ability of the rich to steal from the poor, and the powerful to destroy the planet. I think we can get behind that. Part 2, defend and rebuild just, sustainable, autonomous human communities and assist in the recovery of the land base. Now, these 2 goals are interdependent. The movements involved are going to have to work in tandem for either to be successful. One or the other is not going to do it. And that's why I really want the permaculture wing to get on board. We need them to do part 2. That's their job. It's going to take lots and lots of people to do part 2. and mostly above ground, and mostly involved in fairly large organizations, and mostly nonviolent. Most of this could be done using nonviolence again. Part one could be achieved using nonviolent tactics. We don't have the numbers, and I think most of us in this room probably know that. So it's going to take that underground network that's both well-trained and dead serious. Now, in case you can't find a way to hope, I think there is some hope. The above ground could take some inspiration from the French labor strike that happened last October. Now, this was, in defense of workers' rights. They used trucks, burning tires, and human chains to blockade the fuel depots, and they closed all 12 of France's oil refineries. The major oil terminal was offline for 3 weeks, which stranded 30 oil tankers in the Mediterranean because they couldn't offload the oil. When the government tried to open the emergency reserves, they escalated, and the protesters went on to blockade 20 more terminals. This is what you do. In a few weeks, the entire economy of the country was slowing to a halt for lack of fuel. Now, that's thinking systematically, and they were headed toward that cascading systems failure because they hit the nodes that were important. The energy infrastructure is absolutely crucial. This is what you learn to do when you are at military training camp, and there's no reason we can't apply these principles. Now, so the French did what every military and every insurgency does, whether you agree with them or not, left or right. They all use the same tactics because they work. They were well on their way to completely shutting down the economy, and they did it using nonviolence. So this could be done if we had the bodies. The question is, do we? For the underground, I would say that your best inspiration is MEND. This is the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. Now, the oil industry has earned literally billions of dollars off of Nigeria's oil supply. The Niger Delta is the world's largest wetland, and you could not call it a wetland anymore. You could call it a sludge land, perhaps, but it's completely dead. The people there used to be self-sufficient as fishers and farmers. No more. They're all sick and starving because the oil industry has killed them and killed the land. Oil accounts for 40% of the gross domestic product of Nigeria. So they control the government. It's a military junta, on and on. The indigenous people had an original resistance that was called Mosop, and this was led by the poet-activist Ken Saro-Wiwa. This was a nonviolent campaign to drive out Royal Dutch Shell and the military regime. In 1995, Saro-Wiwa and 8 of his friends, the leaders of this movement, were all hanged by a military tribunal. It was just completely corrupt. Huge outcry around the world, human rights organizations. Nobody could save them. They were all killed. So MEND is the second generation, and they do not use nonviolent tactics. They use a lot of property destruction. They do direct attacks on, and they do kidnapping too. I shouldn't, sugarcoat this. They do kidnapping. But they do attacks on pipelines, on bridges, on terminals, on storage facilities, pipelines, all of it, support vessels. They have reduced Nigeria's oil output by a dramatic 1/3. In one single attack, they were able to stop 10% of the country's oil output. One attack, 10%. They did a series of attacks last December, right before Christmas. 80% of the oil went down in 1 week. Right, this could be done. And so this main tactic is the use of speedboats in surprise attacks against simultaneous targets at the same time, right, toward that goal of disrupting the entire system. So cascading systems failure. You figure out the nodes, you attack them. And these people are quite serious. The French did it non-violently because they had the numbers. MEND uses these other tactics because they don't. What we know about MEND is they have university educations. They've studied other militant movements very clearly. Their training in combat is so good that they have gone up against Nigeria's elite fighting units as well as the private militaries of the oil industry. Pause. Did you know that the oil industry has they have their own private militaries? Yeah. I'm sure you have this discussion all the time with people in your lives, but where do you think oil comes from? I mean, you can't plant it in the backyard with the nasturtiums people, right? It doesn't fall out of the sky like rain. It's got to be ripped out of the land, which means people have to be ripped off the land, which means those people have to be ripped in half, and that would be called a private military. So MEND has come up against these folks, and they've won in these skirmishes. They also have, quote, broad sympathy among the Niger Delta community. So that sympathy helps them a lot because it means people take them in. They don't turn them over to the authorities. This is a true resistance movement. It's not a bunch of armed thugs, and they number just a few hundred. So understand this. A few hundred people, well-trained, with the correct strategy, well-organized, they have reduced the oil output of Nigeria by 1/3. MEND has said to the oil industry, leave our land while you can or die in it. Now, I can guarantee that everyone in this room, as an individual, has more resources at our disposals than all of MEND had put together when they started. Resistance is not just theoretically possible, it's happening now. The only real question is, will we join them? What if we said, leave our land or you will die in it? And what if we meant it?
off with a couple kind of supplementary slides here, going off of the idea of a culture of resistance and using some other additional tactical examples. So I think there's an idea really that's prominent on the left that when things get bad enough, then at that point people will change, and then there will be a mass movement, and then we can, do all of these other things. And so one of the things that I've studied in studying resistance movements more generally is resistance movements in Europe, of course, because there were so many that sprang up during World War II when countries became occupied. And you can learn a lot from these kind of accelerated developments that happened in many different places. And so one of the questions that I often come across is, why wasn't there very much resistance in Germany at the heart of fascism? Because, of course, there was huge resistance all across Europe, in occupied Europe, but there was relatively little in Germany itself. And so one of the things that people will tell me when I kind of have asked this question in the past, well, they'll say, it's, the Gestapo, there was a police state, people were too scared about their families, it was too dangerous in Germany. But of course, that really applied anywhere. I mean, it applied in Poland or Czechoslovakia or Denmark. It was always dangerous everywhere. In those places, people resisted in much greater numbers and more effectively. I didn't really understand it until I came across a public opinion survey that had been done in Germany in 1952. So this is a picture of, the reconstruction of Berlin in 52. And at that point, this was, after the war, after the Nuremberg trials. So the crimes of the Nazis were really very well known, including the Holocaust and medical experimentation and all of that. And so there was a survey of public opinion to ask people, if you had known during the war, if you had known of the crimes of the Nazis, would it have been appropriate to resist? They weren't asked, if they personally would resist, because obviously for almost all of them the answer was no. They were just asked, would it have been appropriate? And only 40% of people said yes, which is appalling but not surprising. And then they asked a follow-up question, which was, okay, so let's say there was a war on at the time, which of course in any fascist, authoritarian, expansionist country is all the time. They were asked, well then if there was a war on, would it have been okay to resist? And the number of people who said yes dropped to 20%. So I think that this is really important to kind of understand and internalize, that people who are not part of a culture of resistance, who are part of the dominant culture and identify with that authority, are not going to be able to muster that kind of resistance in mass numbers, even when the crimes are really obvious. And so, okay, well, these are, the regular kind of German people who maybe were benefiting from the expansion and the economic boost of the war and this sort of thing. So what about people who were, German citizens who were caught up in the concentration camps and who were caught up in the Holocaust itself? Surely they would have been, converted. Surely they would have undertaken resistance when they're personally confronted with, their own murder and the destruction of their family. And we can actually answer this question because there were people like Bruno Biedelheim, who's a psychologist and a survivor of the concentration camps. And so he wrote quite a bit about this in his later career. And I'll read something that he wrote from his experience in Dachau and Buchenwald concentration camps. And he said, quote, non-political middle-class prisoners, a minority group in the concentration camps, were those least able to withstand the initial shock. They were utterly unable to understand what had happened to them and why. More than ever, they clung to what had given them self-respect up to that moment. Even while being abused, they would assure the SS they had never opposed Nazism. Their only objection was that they had become objects of a persecution which in itself must be just, since the authorities had opposed it. They rationalized their difficulty by insisting it was all a mistake. So they were saying, well, sure, it's bad for me, but it's just kind of a misunderstanding, which is one of the basic, kind of liberal misapprehensions that we've been talking about again and again. And Biedelheim goes on to talk about how a lot of those people became collaborators and assisted the Stasi, assisted the SS and assisted the concentration camp guards, even though they really got nothing out of it. And so, that example is one where there wasn't a culture of resistance that really developed effectively. But of course, many cultures of resistance do develop effectively, as we've been talking about. But they tend to take time, and they tend to kind of progress through different phases. So I'd like to talk about, for a minute, the development of abolition strategy in the struggle against slavery and abolition tactics in the United States. So early white abolitionists in the US really based their strategy on moral suasion. So their idea was that, especially religious people like Quakers, their idea was that they would go around from, kind of house to house or farm to farm and try to convince people on a one-on-one basis that slavery was wrong and that people should liberate their slaves. And so they would use, moral arguments. Am I not a brother and a man? Saying that slavery was a sin, that it was an affront to God, and this sort of thing. And of course, they did have some success in that way. I think there are always kind of moral early adopters. There's a certain percent of the population that will take on those moral arguments. But they reached a limit. There's only so many people who can be kind of convinced in that fashion when the plantation owners or the slave holders are personally and economically benefiting so much from that system. And so at the same time, there was this increasing development of the Underground Railroad, which was led by people like Harriet Tubman. And there's a misconception about the Underground Railroad that it was something that was kind of run by well-meaning whites who would then risk their lives to help people who were enslaved to escape. But actually the Underground Railroad was mostly run by black people who were often operating pretty much alone or in small groups, as kind of underground movements often do. And so the people like Harriet Tubman, who ran the Underground Railroad and who were conductors, were incredibly brave and effective given their numbers. But they knew that there was a limit to what they were accomplishing. So in a really successful year, they might free, 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people and get them, out of the South and escaped into the North or into Canada. But the problem was that the growth of slavery at the time, the growth of enslaved people by birth, was far, far faster than they could make up for by smuggling people out through the Underground Railroad. So as time went on, people increasingly wanted to shift to more aggressive tactics, people like Harriet Tubman, and also people like this man, John Brown, who was a militant abolitionist. And he was not much for talking and dialogue. He was a man of action. So he would go to, abolitionist meetings and complain about how it was all talk and said, what we need is action, action. And so he hatched a plan along with several others. And the plan was basically this. They would go to the armory at Harper's Ferry, and they would seize the armory, and they would, they would get the arms and the powder and so forth, and they would disseminate into the South in basically guerrilla groups and lead what some historians have called an insurgency of self-defense. So they would go from plantation to plantation, and they would liberate enslaved people, and some of those people would go into hiding in the hills or remote areas, and some of those people would kind of join this armed insurgency. And it would spread and spread until all of the plantations had been depopulated of the slaves, and the economy of the South collapsed. And there were many people, many historians who believe that this was actually a very sound strategy and would have worked out perhaps very effectively and successfully if there weren't some hurdles along the way. And so one of the hurdles involved numbers. So John Brown, they had been kind of behind the scenes organizing to get people to show up for this event, for the kind of the start of this uprising. And they'd done fundraising and kind of underground logistics, and they'd gotten about 1,000 firearms that they would use to start off with, even before they took over, this armory. And so John Brown thought, 1,000 people, that would be perfect. 1,000 to start off with would be exactly what we need. And so on the morning of the action, the number of people who showed up was 20. So they had, many arms per person at that point already. But John Brown said, okay, well, this problem isn't going to go away if we don't do anything. So we'll just go ahead with the people we have, because that's what we've got to do. And so they did. And they were able to successfully capture the armory. And that's where things kind of went off the rails. And it's not exactly clear why they made some of the decisions that they did and why John Brown did. But they captured a couple of townspeople who'd come to try to stop them from taking over the armory. But instead of taking what they needed and moving on in the traditional kind of guerrilla hit-and-run fashion, which he probably wasn't very familiar with, they actually stayed in Harper's Ferry for a fairly long time. And they allowed these captured people to order out for breakfast and go on escorted visits with their families and this sort of thing. And so they stayed there for a day, by which time the army was able to march from the next town, and they were captured, and many of them were hanged. And so he obviously made some tactical mistakes. But what I think is interesting is how many people really condemned him at the time, even abolitionists. There was a fairly low-level support among white abolitionists for John Brown. And they said, oh, you've really gone too far. Like, this is really violent. How could you, the same kind of pacifists, like, how could you fight violence with violence? This isn't going to work. And one of the reasons that John Brown did this was because he really saw the writing on the wall in the antebellum South. He saw that the growing size of slavery, the increasing slave state power as they expanded, was really meaning. He saw that there was going to be a civil war, essentially, and that this conflict between these different forces was inevitably going to lead to great violence. And of course, that's what happened. Only a few months after the raid on Harper's Ferry, the Civil War broke out, and it was, in terms of soldier deaths, it was the bloodiest war in American history. More soldiers died then than in any war before or since. And I think that this is a really important lesson for us to internalize, that being nice and that using persuasive tactics and using nonviolent tactics doesn't necessarily lead to a nonviolent outcome. In fact, it can lead to an extremely violent outcome. And I think that especially when we're looking down the barrel of a horrendous climate collapse and the effects of destroying the biosphere of a planet, that the violence that we are going to face and experience as a people in the next few decades are going to be really horrendous if we can't identify and rapidly implement the strategies and tactics that are going to need to be used to stop that with the least amount of violence possible. Another example of a resistance movement that kind of went through different developmental phases is the resistance movement in France during World War II. Here's a photo of Hitler shortly after Paris was occupied. And so when France was initially occupied, people were really in a state of shock. The Nazis had expanded and occupied Europe in a very short period of time. No one had really expected that they would have so much power and so much control so quickly. And so they were quite stunned. And early kind of examples of French resistance were not very inspiring. Started to change around 1943. There is a really dramatic shift in the dialogue of underground resistance newspapers. So you saw, newspapers that before had privileged spiritual resistance and argued for, nonviolence and this sort of thing. They started publishing editorials saying it was the duty of every French person to assassinate Nazi officers and this sort of thing. And you saw a dramatic increase in that year of assassinations, also of sabotage, of attacks on rail lines and communication infrastructure, and all of these things. And one of the reason that it started to change at that time in particular was because it started to look like the Nazis might lose the war. So that kind of facade of invincibility that they had tried so hard to cultivate and stamp into people was starting to crack. And that, along with well-organized, underground infrastructure and communications, was really what enabled large numbers of people to take on that action, to take on more serious action, and to take on real resistance. And I think that in some ways we're approaching some parallels now. I think that the cracks in industrial civilization are really starting to show, whether we're talking about skyrocketing oil prices, food crises, economic collapses. And I think that then, as now, it's time to make that shift to a more serious kind of resistance. And I think that if we can do that, then we'll win.